The first time I saw him, I knew he was trouble. Adrian. The name rolled off my tongue like a forbidden fruit, sweet yet dangerous. He was the son of my husband Richard, a man twice my age who had swept me off my feet with his wealth and charm. Our marriage was a contract, a transaction where I traded my youth for his stability. But Adrian, he was a wild card. A storm that threatened to upend everything. It was a warm summer evening when Richard introduced us. Adrian had just returned from years of studying abroad, and the air was thick with tension the moment our eyes met. He was tall, with a lean muscular frame that spoke of hours spent in the gym. His dark hair was tousled, and his piercing green eyes seemed to see right through me. There was a smirk playing on his lips, one that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. "This is Adrian, my son," Richard said, his voice filled with pride. "Adrian, this is Elizabeth, my wife." Adrian's eyes lingered on me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and smooth. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The way he said my name sent a jolt of electricity through me. I forced a smile, trying to hide the unease that was creeping into my chest. "Likewise," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and heated exchanges. Adrian was bold, unafraid to challenge me in ways that Richard never did. He would make snide remarks about our marriage, his words laced with a venom that cut deep. But it wasn't just his words that got to me. It was the way he looked at me, like he could see the cracks in my facade, the way he would brush past me, his touch lingering just a second too long. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen trying to calm my racing thoughts. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn, and there he was, leaning against the doorway with that same infuriating smirk. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to shield myself from his penetrating gaze. "What do you want, Adrian?" He took a step closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I just wanted to see if you're as cold as you pretend to be." His words sent a wave of anger through me, but there was something else too, something I didn't want to acknowledge. "You have no right to talk to me like that," I snapped, my voice trembling. Adrian chuckled, a low, throaty sound that made my stomach flip. "Oh, I think I do," he said, closing the distance between us. "You're not fooling anyone, Elizabeth. I see the way you look at me when you think no one's watching." I felt my cheeks flush and I turned away, trying to hide the truth in my eyes. "You're delusional," I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Am I?" he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Or are you just too scared to admit the truth?" I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave me alone, but my body betrayed me. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the heat pooling in my core. "Adrian," I started, but my voice was barely a whisper. He didn't give me a chance to finish. His lips crashed against mine and I was lost. The kiss was fierce, filled with a raw passion that I hadn't felt in years. His hands were everywhere, pulling me closer, exploring every inch of my body. I knew I should stop, that this was wrong, but I couldn't. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and I was falling into the abyss. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my body trembling with desire. "You can't deny it anymore," he said, his voice filled with triumph. "You want this as much as I do." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself nodding, my body betraying my mind. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible. Adrian's eyes darkened with desire, and he pulled me into another kiss, this one even more intense than the last. His hands roamed over my body, igniting a fire that I couldn't control. I knew this was dangerous, that we were playing with fire, but I didn't care. In that moment, all that mattered was the heat between us, the passion that threatened to consume us both. As the night wore on, we gave in to our desires, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. And when the morning came, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The line between sin and passion had been erased, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and forbidden glances. Adrian and I danced around each other, our interactions laced with a tension that was impossible to ignore. Every touch, every word was charged with an electricity that threatened to consume us both. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that the heat between us would eventually fade, but deep down I knew better. The fire had been lit, and there was no putting it out. It was late one evening when Richard announced he had to leave for a business trip. He kissed me goodbye, his lips cold and perfunctory, and I felt a pang of guilt as I watched him walk out the door. The moment he was gone, the air in the house shifted, becoming heavier, more suffocating. I knew Adrien would come for me, and the thought both terrified and excited me. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book, when I heard his footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His presence was like a storm, impossible to ignore. "Alone at last," he said, his voice low and teasing. I kept my eyes on the book, though I wasn't reading a single word. "What do you want, Adrien?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around the couch and sat down beside me, his body so close that I could feel the heat radiating from him. "You know what I want," he said, his voice a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. "This is wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Adrien smirked, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "Is it?" he asked, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "Or is it just what we both need?" I wanted to argue, to tell him that we were playing with fire, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying my mind. "Adrien," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't give me a chance to finish. His lips crashed against mine and I was lost. The kiss was fierce, filled with a raw passion that I hadn't felt in years. His hands were everywhere, pulling me closer, exploring every inch of my body. I knew I should stop, that this was wrong, but I couldn't. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and I was falling into the abyss. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my body trembling with desire. "You can't deny it anymore," he said, his voice filled with triumph. "You want this as much as I do." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself nodding, my body betraying my mind. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible. Adrien's eyes darkened with desire, and he pulled me into another kiss, this one even more intense than the last. His hands roamed over my body, igniting a fire that I couldn't control. I knew this was dangerous, that we were playing with fire, but I didn't care. In that moment, all that mattered was the heat between us, the passion that threatened to consume us both. As the night wore on, we gave in to our desires, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. And when the morning came, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The line between sin and passion had been erased, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and heated exchanges. Adrien and I were like two magnets, drawn together by a force we couldn't resist. Every touch, every kiss was a reminder of the fire that burned between us. But with each passing day, the guilt grew heavier, a constant weight on my chest. One evening, as we lay tangled in each other's arms, Adrien turned to me, his eyes filled with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "What are we doing, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of his question. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I can't stop." Adrien sighed, pulling me closer. "Neither can I," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of desire and regret. "But we can't keep doing this. Not like this." I knew he was right, but the thought of letting him go was unbearable. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Adrien was silent for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "We figure it out," he said finally, his voice filled with determination. "Together." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that we were playing with fire. But in that moment, all that mattered was the heat between us, the passion that threatened to consume us both. And as I lay in his arms, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Adrien and I crossed that forbidden line were a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt gnawed at me every time Richard called, his voice warm and unsuspecting. Yet, the pull toward Adrien was undeniable. a force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. We were careful, or at least we tried to be, stealing glances and fleeting touches whenever Richard wasn't around. But the weight of our secret was becoming unbearable. One evening, as I sat alone in the garden, Adrien found me. The moonlight cast a soft glow over his features, making him look almost ethereal. He sat beside me, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low and probing. "Are you having second thoughts?" I hesitated, my fingers nervously twisting the hem of my dress. "I don't know what I'm feeling anymore," I admitted. It's all so complicated." Adrien reached out, his hand gently covering mine. "It doesn't have to be," he said, his tone earnest. "We could leave. Start over somewhere new. Where no one knows us." His words took me by surprise. The idea was tempting, but the reality was far more daunting. "And what about Richard?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's your brother, Adrien. How could we ever face him?" Adrien's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked conflicted. "I know it's not ideal," he said finally. "But sometimes, you have to choose what makes you happy, even if it's hard." I looked away, my heart torn. Richard had been my anchor for so long. But Adrien had awakened something in me that I hadn't known existed. The thought of leaving everything behind was terrifying, but so was the idea of living a lie. The next few days were a blur of internal conflict. I avoided Adrien as much as possible, needing space to think. But he was persistent, showing up unexpectedly. His presence a constant reminder of the choice I had to make. One afternoon, he cornered me in the library, his eyes blazing with determination. "You can't keep running from this, Elizabeth," he said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." I sighed, knowing he was right. "What do you want me to say, Adrien?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "That I'm ready to throw away everything for you? Because I'm not sure I am." Adrien stepped closer, his gaze softening. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away," he said gently. "I'm asking you to choose what's best for you. If that's Richard, then I'll respect that. But if it's me, then we need to figure this out together." His words struck a chord, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm scared," I confessed, my voice trembling. "Scared of hurting Richard. Scared of what people will say. Scared of losing everything." Adrien reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But sometimes, the things that scare us the most are the ones worth fighting for." His sincerity broke down the walls I had built around my heart, and I found myself nodding. "Okay," I whispered. "Let's figure this out together." From that moment on, things changed. Adrien and I began to plan, cautiously and discreetly. We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we were determined to make it work. The guilt was still there, a constant shadow, but it was overshadowed by the hope of a future where we could be together without hiding. One night, as we sat by the fireplace, Adrien turned to me, his expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been offered a job in another city. It's a fresh start, a chance for us to leave all of this behind." My heart raced at the thought. A new city, a new life. It was everything we had been dreaming of, but it also meant leaving everything we knew behind. "When do we leave?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. Adrien smiled, a mixture of relief and excitement in his eyes. "As soon as you're ready," he said. "We'll tell Richard together, and then we'll go." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making the right choice. As I leaned into Adrien's embrace, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Adrien and I were ready to take the leap, to leave behind the shadows of our past, and step into the light of a new beginning. And as I looked out the window at the rising sun, I felt a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future where love, no matter how complicated, could prevail. The days following Elizabeth and Adrien's decision to leave were filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. Elizabeth's heart was a battlefield of emotions. Love for Adrien, guilt toward Richard, and fear of the unknown. She knew their journey wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the only way to live authentically. The morning of their departure, Elizabeth woke up with a heavy heart. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet elegant outfit. As if preparing for a battle, Adhering was already waiting for her in the living room. His suitcase packed, and his expression a mix of determination and concern. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his voice steady but laced with tension. Elizabeth nodded, though her hands trembled. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, forcing a smile. Together they walked out of the house, leaving behind the life they had known. The drive to the train station was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Elizabeth stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into the distance. She wondered if she would ever see this place again, if she would ever be able to make peace with her choices. When they arrived at the station, Adhering took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We're in this together," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "No matter what happens, we'll face it as a team." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the bustling station. The train ride to their new city was long and uneventful. Elizabeth spent most of it staring out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of Richard. She wondered how he was coping, if he hated her, if he would ever forgive her. The guilt was a constant weight on her chest, but she tried to remind herself that she had made this choice for a reason. For love, for freedom, for a chance at happiness. When they finally arrived, the city greeted them with a cacophony of sounds and sights. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. Adhering had rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and as they stepped inside, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of relief. The space was modest but cozy, with large windows that let in the afternoon light. "This is our home now," Adhering said, his voice filled with hope. Elizabeth smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's perfect," she said, trying to sound convincing. She knew it would take time to adjust, to truly feel at home in this new place. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. Adhering started his new job, leaving Elizabeth alone in the apartment for long hours. She tried to keep herself busy, but the silence was deafening. The guilt and loneliness crept in, and she found herself questioning her decision more than once. Was this really the right choice? Had she made a terrible mistake? One evening, as Adhering returned home, he found Elizabeth sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. "Hey," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth shook her head, unable to find the words. Adhering wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "It's okay to feel this way," he said softly. "This is a big change and it's normal to have doubts. But we'll get through this together, I promise." His words were a balm to her wounded heart, and she leaned into his embrace, letting herself feel safe for the first time in days. "I'm just so scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What if we made the wrong choice? What if we can't make this work?" Adhering cupped her face in his hands, his gaze steady and reassuring. "We didn't make this choice lightly," he said. "We chose each other because we believe in this, in us. It's going to be hard, but it's worth it. We're worth it." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "We'll make this work no matter what." As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth began to find her footing. She explored the city, discovering hidden gems, and making small connections with the people around her. She started writing again, something she hadn't done in years, and found solace in putting her thoughts and feelings onto paper. Slowly but surely, she began to build a new life, a life with Adhering. One night, as they sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Elizabeth turned to Adhering with a smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude, "for believing in us, for being here with me." Adhering smiled back, his eyes soft with affection. "Always," he said, taking her hand in his. "No matter what happens, we're in this together." Elizabeth felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And for the first time in a long time, She allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a happy ending. Months passed, and the city that once felt foreign began to feel like home. Elizabeth and Adrian had settled into a rhythm, their lives intertwining in ways that felt both natural and profound. The initial turmoil had given way to a sense of stability, though the scars of their past still lingered, a quiet reminder of the choices they had made. Elizabeth had found a job at a local bookstore, a place that quickly became her sanctuary. Surrounded by books and the quiet hum of readers, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. The work was simple, but it allowed her to reconnect with her love for stories and words. It was here, among the shelves and the smell of old paper, that she began to heal. Adrian, too, had found his place in their new life. His job was demanding, but he thrived on the challenges it presented. He came home each evening with stories of his day, his enthusiasm infectious. Elizabeth loved seeing him like this, confident, driven, and happy. It was a side of him she hadn't fully known before, and it made her fall in love with him all over again. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Adrian turned to Elizabeth with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about Richard?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Elizabeth hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice soft. "I wonder how he's doing, if he's happy. I hope he's found peace." Adrian nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I think about him too," he said. "I know we can't change what happened, but I hope one day he'll be able to forgive us." Elizabeth reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We can't control that." As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. They grew closer, their bond deepening with each passing day. They learned to navigate the challenges of their new life together, supporting each other through the ups and downs. There were moments of doubt, of course, but they always found their way back to each other, their love a constant anchor in the storm. One spring morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside their window. She turned to see Adrian still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in the soft light. She watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with gratitude. Despite everything, they had built a life together, a life filled with love, hope, and possibility. Later that day, tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." Adrian's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. In that moment, everything else faded away, the guilt, the pain, the uncertainty. All that mattered was the love they shared, a love that had endured and triumphed against all odds. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the park where Adrian had proposed. Surrounded by a few close friends and the beauty of nature, they exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. As they stood there hand in hand, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. This was her new beginning, her chance to build a future filled with love and happiness. Years later, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset, Elizabeth turned to Adrian with a smile. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Adrian nodded, his eyes soft with affection. "Every day," he said, "and I'm so grateful for every moment of it." Elizabeth leaned into him, her heart full. They had faced their demons, made their choices, and built a life together. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as they sat there, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue, she knew that their love would continue to guide them, no matter what the future held.